Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. We're thrilled to be joined by Laurie Pinkerton Rolet, Director of Park Grove Design. She's based in Brighton. She's also a fellow podcaster. She's founder of ThirdAge.design. I'll put links on the spiel that goes with the podcast and also on the Journal of Biophilic.design.com. She's also on the British Standards Committee for Furnishing Fabrics, which she's going to talk about a bit later. But Laurie, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work and what you do there?
Yes, so I'm director of Park Grove Design. We specialize in care, dementia, retirement, design, plus hotels and some property developing work. And you'll be surprised how much overlap there is actually between all of those sectors. If you get fabrics which don't stain for a care home, you may well want to use them in the hotel where people are drinking red wine on the sofa. So actually the database of suppliers does transfer over quite well in that respect. And also you do get hotels with older people sometimes staying in them. So some of those considerations come into play. I'm a past president of the British Institute of Interior Design. I have a CAPS 2 qualification, which means Certified Aging in Place Specialist, which is a qualification I had to fly back to the US to get. You can probably hear from my voice, I'm American originally, but I have no excuse for still having the accent as I've been here 32 years. That's sort of what I do. Then I have this podcast, ThirdAge.design, which shares information about the care and dementia retirement design sector internationally. So, you know, what are they doing in Japan? Is that something we want to think about here? How come they don't know that we're doing light reflective value differences? What can they learn for us? And so it's an open, free forum for sharing information internationally.
That's fantastic, and it is a really good podcast. So anybody who's listening, I suggest you do Google and search it and add it to your RSS feeds. What got you into design in the first place, Laurie? When we've spoken before, prior to this podcast, you speak with such passion, and it's like it courses through your veins. I mean, what actually sort of started you off on it?
I think I was naturally drawn to it. I mean, this is an embarrassing story, but just briefly, when I was a teenager, sort of 13, 14 years old, you would babysit for people to make, pocket money. And they would go out for the evening. I'd put the children in bed and then I'd rearrange the furniture. I mean, how offended would you be but they always liked it. I could, you'd just be sitting there and you think it's not right. It would look so much better this way. And they never put it back. And then I had one babysitting job where they'd have me look at different rooms every time I'd come once the kids were in bed. I was only 13 years old. Then when I started to get into the care design side of things when my children were very small, and we would visit my grandmother in what was considered a nice home. And it wasn't a nice environment. And the children never wanted to go, but whenever they did, the entire environment would change. People would come out of their rooms, the staff would start smiling, and the whole thing was different. And I started questioning the kids, why don't you like to go there? Well, it smells bad and it's kind of depressing. And when you sort of picked it out, you then started thinking, well, the environment matters not only to the residents, but also to the staff and also to any visitors they might get. And also it's somebody's life. Yeah. Lots of times, if you're moving into facilities like this is where you're going to live possibly for the rest of your life. It should be something that if you ever, go out, when you come back, you're glad to be home, not that you're in a place where you've been put. I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, some of the places are very institutionalized, doesn't it? It feels like it's something out of some weird 1950s dystopian novel. You know, I've had family that have been in these places, and you go in and you can't, you know, it's as a punter, as a visitor, as it were, you can't understand why the people who are designing and actually working in there, and the managers of these spaces, I can't understand why they're not wanting to make the spaces better. I mean, obviously there's a lot of good places and stuff, but some places are still, you know, living in the dark ages, really. Yeah.
And I think it's tied a little bit, and part of this is biophilic design relates to quite directly. I'm going to relate it to television. When TV first started, when radio first started, it was vaudeville, just sound. When TV started, it was radio with pictures. There wasn't really anything else to it. We've then gone through what was television into what is now more or less streaming services. So the whole thing has evolved to become another thing. Care homes very much started out as hospitals. It was a hospital model, and they're selling, they're offering care. Therefore, that was a natural place to go, and they already existed. They've not yet become what they want to be, which is what they want to be is someplace where people aspire to live because it's easier, because you can make your own food or someone else can make it for you, because you have social spaces with lots of people around you to so that you're solving the loneliness thing, so that there are beautiful gardens and grounds that you don't have to tend anymore because you don't feel like it, perhaps. Or if you do feel like it, where you can get engaged in that activity. That would be an aspirate where there are spa facilities, where there's a library, where it's not just your physical needs being met, but where there's a book club or an author of the month that comes in and talks to people, or a continuing adult education. You don't stop living because you're in a home. You should actually start living in a better way than when you were on your own looking after a house.
Absolutely, that's really lovely, and I love what you're doing, because you're pushing this forward. You're pushing this concept forward. I mean, why is it important to create happier and healthier environments for the older generation? I mean, obviously, it should be self-explanatory, but just to kind of hammer it home, really, why for you is it really important?
I think I'm going to give one reference to the States, but in general, if you think about the way we live and how culturally often we let kids just go out and run around now, as opposed to when I was a child, think about how much more time the older generation, people older than me, spent outdoors. Yeah. They spent a lot more. So in terms of getting in touch with what feels like a comfortable, natural living environment for you, to try to engage with something even as simple as ventilation, which is an important part of biophilic design. All houses weren't sealed buildings with double glazed windows and no air circulation between them. Having the ability to have fresh air circulating, to get out onto a terrace, to get out into a garden, absolutely fundamental to a sense of a normal life, particularly for older people, because they didn't grow up necessarily in that closed buildings, potential sick building environment. There's something I wish would take off here, but I don't suspect it will in the UK. It's a very US thing, which is rocking chairs on a porch. It's very common in the United States, and not just in certain parts of the United States, but all over the United States, to have houses with porches. Especially any older properties will always have a porch, and almost always have rocking chairs or some sort of seating outside. Lots of times people will screen these in because they have a lot more mosquitoes there than we do as well. But you would often see, as I was growing up, older people in the rocking chairs on the front porch saying hello to the neighbors, engaging with the neighborhood in an indoor-outdoor space, having that fresh air, seeing the changes of the season, changing clothing because of weather change, which was just an important part of living, not just being sealed off someplace. So I think it's particularly important for the older generation to have that interaction, and also to engage outside of a building. Even if you've got limited mobility, there are ways of doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you know, I do think, and I'm completely with you, that this should be, it should be second nature for designers. It should be, you know, almost like, well, how would I like to be when I'm that age? What sort of environment would I like to be in, for instance, you know, by that mindset? I mean, what are you finding are the main challenges with, you know, sort of getting this kind of design or these concepts, you know, the indoor, outdoor, even the biophilic design? I mean, what sort of, what are the main challenges that you're finding you're coming up?
Number one, cost.
Cost, yeah.
So in order to, and cost ties in with a lot of other things such as acoustics. So for example, Park Grove designed a sort of a blueprint of a model biophilic design home that a group, which shall remain unmentioned, was going to roll out. And there was a lot of floor to ceiling glass. It met standards in terms of heat coming in, and you know, we looked at all that. But by the time you start to dampen, and lots of views out, by the time you start to dampen the acoustics in terms of the flooring and the windows at night in terms of the darkness coming in, and it just keeps going, ramping up costs, it starts to become a model that's quite different to that of a normal care facility, where previously, and by previously I mean as little as 10 years ago, whoever was the manager of the home would get sent these catalogs of furniture, for example, all of which was mainly Queen Anne. Now, Queen Anne is like the smallest amount of properties in the UK that you can possibly imagine. 90% of the housing stock is Victorian. But these furniture companies couldn't sell the Queen Anne stuff, so they discount it and sell it as nursing home furniture, which is why you always got those kind of old looking things, and why a lot of care homes look the same. And they'd get these magazines, oh, we need new chairs, okay, that one's better than that, and that's how they were picked. So part of the model of the interior and the way they were is that it A, started out as this hospital concept, but B, was never designed by a designer. It was designed by somebody who's managing vulnerable people and staff and relatives and again. So that's a really big part of it. The other main challenge is the supply chain. So I have been banging a drum that no one's been hearing for at least a decade. There are some tremendous vinyl flooring companies which do a great job. There are some tremendous impervious backed carpet companies with low pile that's very good for people with walkers, or where you're not trying to create, you know, trip hazards, low pile things. Can I get them to speak to each other in terms of colors? No. And the issue is, especially with dementia, you need to keep the colors going from one space on to another similar in depth, because otherwise someone with dementia will be standing on a lighter colored surface looking onto a darker one and think that that's an abyss, and will not go forward. And it can be very unsettling for people, but I cannot get one hand to talk to the other. So I find that aspect of the supply chain and the amount of chemicals used in treating fabrics to be a potential health and well-being concern.
Yeah, I mean, how can we get the people talking together? I mean, what could be a thing? I mean, I know you said you was at the Dementia Care event in Birmingham. I mean, obviously that's a start, that's a place, but I mean, short of actually rounding them all up and putting them in a pen and then not letting them go before they sign a piece of paper saying, yes, we're going to talk to somebody. Maybe that's the way. But I don't know. Obviously we're sort of doing the podcasts and stuff. What else can we do? What can we...
Well, I think you've actually almost hit the nail on the head. I think it's a lunch someplace.
Yeah.
Where, you know, you'd be embarrassed not to attend, and we actually do put people in the same room and close the door and say, let's, you know, you say you're selling to this sector.
Yeah.
You understand what the parameters are. I've got people on both sides, both from the carpeting standpoint and from the vinyl standpoint, coming to me to ask about color. But they will not speak to each other. So I think that might be something I have to do in the future, is either put people together in a room or put people together in a podcast, perhaps, duke it out. Because something has to give, even if it's a small, a couple of small ranges. They'd sell. I mean, there's a commercial benefit. They'd sell like hotcakes.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose in a way you're acting as translator yourself. So I mean, you're always going to need that. It was going to need the designer or that, you know, the translator to do that. And there's a benefit there. But I think yeah, getting a lunch together or getting both on the same podcast is a really good idea. And if I can support or help or anything, just let me know.
Thank you.
No, seriously. How do you see biophilic design helping create better spaces for our older generation?
Contentment and easing of stress.
Yeah.
So there are clients that we've worked with. There's one in North London, and they had this wonderful idea. They had a very sloped site, so not particularly easy for going out and about, but they designed into the buildings what they called winter gardens.
Oh, okay.
So it's like conservatories, but they can, you know, be on higher floors as well, and very much, you know, looking at the treetops, the seasonal changes, being able to open to create great amounts of air ventilation and fresh air and smells. Part of the it's not just putting plants, having access to the outdoors and windows at a height that people can look out of. It's acoustics, which I touched on a couple minutes ago, with the glass and the floor. It's getting acoustics. It sounds different when you go outside. It's a slightly deader atmosphere in a lot of ways, because there are lots of different surfaces and textures and spaces that absorb and bounce sound in a different way. That in and of itself can be very calming for somebody. To not have everything bouncing back off of a wall where you're feeling enclosed. Your life feels expansive when you go out. There are smells. Smells are part of life. Let's face it, the smells inside a nursing home are not always the most pleasant. So we use aromatherapy, and used effectively. We have homes. I've never smelled a care home smell in those homes. That has to do with the type of fabrics that we use, the type of surface materials that we use. But then also, what about bringing some of those scents inside? So you can have a pine tree scent, or if you're doing dementia, you can have a scent of baking bread to remind people on some very physiological level that they're hungry and that they should eat something. So we've had indoor-outdoor spaces where we just very silently in the background, without it becoming a Disneyland experience, we'll have a loop of sound, nature sounds in that space, so that even if the weather is rubbish, you're having that indoor-outdoor experience. If you have scents with that and some sounds, again, in a subtle way, that's a very different experience to being locked up in a building in the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think like you said, the outdoor space, Andrea Harmon I was interviewing, you know, from Echophon, she's an expert in sound and sort of audible the sort of psychoacoustic side of things. But she says, nature doesn't have walls. Just like you said, you've got the reverberation when we're indoors, and it's very, especially if you're in some of those care homes, it's very well, yeah, just reflective, isn't it? There's not many, there's like, there's the wardrobe, and then there's the plastic table that they sit at, and there's the plastic wipe clean chairs that they sit at, and there are other options to muffle the sound and to kind of like replicate that, that's the softer side of nature. And as you said, it kind of, because it reverberates and everything, there's lots of fractals and sort of, fractal shapes, if you want to kind of, for the sound to bounce off.
And also in imagery, it can be very nice to have, depending on where in the home it is, and whether dementia is likely to be part of that particular offering, to have a mural, or to have to properly frame views. One thing I loved, this relates back to the podcast. I'm sad because I visit care homes wherever I go in the world to see what they're doing. And I was in, like most people in their vacations, when I was in Japan, I noticed that there'd be like a window, just a normal window, but it happened to have a spectacular view. So rather than having a couple of chairs or a sofa there as a little seating area, they had a table with some chairs and a foot bath underneath.
Nice.
So you could sit there and a stack of towels. You didn't need staff. You could just sit there and have a foot massage and look at the view and actually engage with it. Instead of it just being a source of light, it can actually be another form of art if the designer is incorporating that view into the design, not just as a, oh, look out the window, to actually sit looking out the window.
Yeah. That's lovely. I mean, I'd like to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a visitor. Can I use this? Yeah.
Can I just, do you mind? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, how nice. I mean, what a nice thing to aspire to. I mean, like you say, the benefit of going to these places, visiting these places, you can bring back best practices and, bring them and educate people and say, oh, it's not exactly education. That sounds a bit sort of derogatory, but actually just to inspire people, to go
just to share, because for example, in Japan, they weren't aware of our light reflective value differences, which are really important, especially in dementia, but also as people's eyes age and macular degeneration comes into play. You need some stronger contrasts, unless you're totally familiar with the inside of a space. And lots of times within care, furniture will move for events. So it doesn't tend to be a totally stable atmosphere. Therefore, having those color differentials becomes very, very important. The other thing is plants, which we touched on earlier. The engagement with plants might be something out in the garden that you don't have to look at, but it could be something that you were part of the gardening club.
Yeah.
Raised beds, engage, seasonal changes, and, a responsibility. We, even though you're older, nobody wants to not have value within a society. So if the society happens to be within a building, you're not just help me, I'm helpless. What can you do? How do you want to serve the community? And what's your role that you can take ownership of and engage with that's good for your sense of well-being? And all of these things need to be designed in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a lot, having a garden space or an outdoor space, or to grow vegetables or cut plants or cut flowers. Also the older generation have a wealth of experience, have a wealth of knowledge. Ask them, what grows nice next to that? Or we're growing potatoes, what should we grow with that? I've heard that you grow marigolds with them, or you put garlic in with your roses and it stops the aphids. I mean, they must have like a wealth of stuff that they could share. I've got a stain in my clothes, what can I do? All this sort of stuff to bring them in, to bring their knowledge base in, actually is really important. So also,
and does that feed into the restaurant?
Yeah.
Does that feed into, hey, it's our peas, or,
Yeah.
at lunch today, or, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, get other people to help, collect them. They might not be the gardeners, but maybe they could help shell them and stuff, so it's a real, bringing the nature elements into a space is, it's a community space. It's a home, isn't it? It's that's how
It's a home.
that's how it should be perceived as. It's a home. It's yeah. I mean, you've created some beautiful spaces, and obviously, listeners, I'm putting a link onto the podcast spiel to the links to your website. But is there a particular case study, or a particular place that you've designed that you'd like to share with us? And I know it's going to be quite a challenge, but maybe you could describe either what it was like before, or what you've changed, and sort of just like from your heart what it feels like as well, so people can kind of get that sense of what you've done.
I think well, I like all of them
Yeah.
because they're all so different. One thing I'll give an example. We're quite excited about working with the Royal Hospital Chelsea for the Chelsea pensioners, and we're redoing the interiors of one of the buildings down on the Embankment in London. First of all, the people are amazing, but I also like, it's very interesting to do something with a particular user group that has a unique approach on the world in general. So we are engaging in how we're storing those beautiful scarlet uniforms and the hats, and whether or not that isn't part of why people are so proud to be there and be a pensioner, whether or not that isn't part of the decoration in the corridors, rather than shoved in a wardrobe in some way, for example. Using some of the heritage elements that they have there and incorporating that into the design. So in the entrance to the medical suite, for example, there's an entire wall which we're pin spotting that will show the Chelsea Physic garden, which I don't know how familiar your listeners will be to this, but that was actually planted for medicinal purposes for the Chelsea pensioners. That's where they would grow their medicines. And so this is a very biophilic kind of thing. And so we've got we're putting a giant map in the medical suite of the layout of the Physic garden. Nice. So it's that very, very personal, very, very personal engagement with any group of people, really, which is quite interesting. People will tend to go to a facility or even a retirement village because there's something of interest in that particular place. And so our raison d'etre is to figure out what that is and really explore that quite fully.
Yeah, I mean, that's lovely. And as you mentioned, the Chelsea Physic garden. Again, if people are not familiar with it, I recommend that they Google and find out about it. But yeah, that's a really lovely idea to kind of have a visual record, a map of it to kind of jog their memory, and to kind of to connect them to the space as well, to kind of connect them to the localized space. I think is really important.
And so, to connect it to the medical aspect, because we sort of see that as a different play. Medicine is something that comes in a little pill, but it didn't start out that way. It most likely started out in a plant somewhere, and that's why we need to protect the rainforest and lots of other parts of the planet and the sea and everything else, because this is where we get helped by nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of moving on from that, I mean, what aspects of biophilic design would you really like to see other care homes incorporating in their design? I mean, obviously there's like probably easy wins and there's probably more difficult kind of solutions, but would you have a tick list?
Yeah, I would like to see more interaction with what we call the M&E consultants, which is the mechanical and engineering consultants, and the rest of the design team into being able to put more live plants in spaces. and how that's lit, and almost more importantly, how the humidity level of that is handled. So there are, spectacular atriums across the world, spectacular, great big things, and they're perfectly pleasant to go in without feeling like you're actually in a rainforest. But there's a lot of engineering aspect to that, which makes it quite a difficult proposition with the budgets that are available in these sorts of projects. But even if we were to come up with some sort of a smaller model almost at some point for rolling out an atrium that's more of an immersive garden experience, because it's rubbish weather half the year here. So it would be worth doing. So that's something I would very much like to see. I would like to see more things being done with smell. So we have these dispensers which give out these lovely smells. We don't really have any things that you touch and they give off a smell like happens outdoor. I'm not sure what that looks like, but that's like on a wish list. Down the line. And I would like to see maybe some further use of the virtual reality experiences for people that perhaps are not able-bodied anymore, to be able to have some of those experiences. But again, tied somehow with acoustics and scent. Because that's,
it's all our senses, isn't it? When we awaken that, because we take it for granted. Like you say, you go out into nature. It's like I came home last night and the smell of the lavender at my doorway, and you forget how it releases the smell at night. And actually that's also part of the circadian rhythm thing, isn't it? So if you can create a landscape in a space.
Well, that's a really good example. I mean, outside my bedroom, I'm very lucky. I've got some French doors, and I always grow jasmine, because at night on summer you open the doors and it's absolute heaven. But circadian rhythms and circadian lighting, this Royal Hospital Chelsea project, we're using that as well in order to make people feel better and engage with the day in a more natural fashion. I
mean, it'd be interesting. I mean, obviously we were talking earlier before before we started recording, about technology, and some aspects of technology in care homes that it kind of can be top heavy in terms of budget and things like that. But maybe we could actually look at technology in terms of sensors and things. So imagine like there's a picture of some lavender or something, and as you go past it, it releases the scent. There's like the sort of Internet of Things. Maybe there's or something.
That's the kind of thing that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, because just seeing a picture of something, especially if you really can't get out, isn't an experience. It's a visual experience, but it's not an experience in any other way. There's no airflow coming at you. There's no scent of anything. Exactly.
Imagine that with a seascape or something. I mean, you could do that with a dynamic. I mean, obviously the video head on, but you could do that with like a dynamic view of water coming through, and then you can have the sound of it and that smell of the salt spray, and gosh, you could just do so many things. And you can actually have pebbles in front of it, so people could pick them up and experience, so the whole kind of localized thing. She says, I've got them here next to me.
We designed at the Grand Hotel in Brighton, down on the seafront. And for the restaurant, at one point, we were looking at putting it underground, and that's exactly what I was going to do. I was going to have live cameras coming off the balconies, projected on the walls underneath at the lower ground floor, so you could see in real time, one-to-one, what was actually the view that you might not have gotten otherwise.
Wow, now that's visionary. Now but you're a budget designer. You're a good
no
designer.
Smells though. Only croissant.
I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add at all at this point?
I don't think so. I think it's very, very much the future. At getting the biophilic design And if you use it as that phrase with care and retirement and dementia providers, it doesn't mean anything to them. So it's about absolutely incorporating that into this sense of home and hope and real living that the designers and architects and design team in general need to take on board in order to get away from this hospital model. I think it's fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, I am going to get you back on at some stage to talk about other aspects of Biophilic design and sort of, you know, to track your progress as well. And again, just to reiterate, listeners, you know, please go to Park Grove Design's website. Again, the links I'll put on the spiel, and also have a listen to Laurie's ThirdAge.design podcast. It's really good. It's very inspiring. So really, Laurie, the final question that I ask everybody at the end of these podcasts, and regular listeners will know, and it's my favorite bit. If you could brush the world with like this sort of magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
We would get back to something that people seem to be amazed about at the beginning of the pandemic, which was the being able to see the fish in the canals in Venice, seals on the beach here in Brighton and Hove. Just pulling back, and we're the only species that seems absolutely determined to disassociate from the environment entirely. And that's not really how life works. So the biophilic brush is to say people have taken some of these lessons on board and said, I liked that better when that happened. Let's engage in this more. And then let's get away from having to seal up everything 100% and come somewhere in the middle where we're being sensitive to the needs to energy needs and our carbon footprint and all of that, but in a way that becomes human again. I mean, the best design ever for a building, in my opinion, were Roman villas. So Roman villas, you had a central outdoor courtyard. If you're in England, you might put glass over that, but still. And then around that, you had all your rooms, and everybody could gather. And when they were gathering in the outdoor space. Best design ever.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.